only have one side. We'd like to hear yours.
He got off by watching young girls.
The way her body was posed has never been released before.
Trauma never goes away. The family every day live with that trauma.
The pain from that night, I mean, it's been torment for, a lot of years.
Today we are discussing Colette Aram's murder that went unsolved for almost 30 years before the killer's own son was the one who exposed him. Sarah De Leon, whose tortured body was abandoned by railroad tracks, and 18-year-old Carla Walker, who was abducted right in front of her boyfriend's eyes. Stay tuned as we take you through teen murder mysteries that took decades to solve. Nearly 40 years ago, Colette Aram was brutally murdered as she left her home on October 30th, 1983, to go over to her boyfriend's house, which was only a short walk away. Colette was 16 years old at the time and working as a trainee hairdresser with her whole future ahead of her. This was routine for her. She often woke up in the morning and walked over to her boyfriend's house to spend time with him. But this day, she never made it.
It was very out of character for Colette to go missing. Some children do, and they do that a lot, but not Colette. This was completely out of character.
She would have phoned her mum to say, by the way, I've just popped into Karen's, or I've just popped in, wherever she was going, she would have said. So mum wouldn't worry because she was such a kind, considerate person. And that's why we knew so quickly that Colette was missing.
Her friends and family knew that this was unlike her, disappearing without telling anyone where she was. So they spent the entire night searching for her all over town. Her family raised the alarm when she did not arrive at her boyfriend's house. And after a series of frantic phone calls, they called the police at 10:30 p.m. to try to help family and friends search for Colette. At 9 a.m. the following morning, her brother Mark discovered her naked body dumped in a field about 1.5 miles from where she had been abducted. Colette's body had been assaulted multiple times, and she had been strangled to death. However, the police couldn't find any evidence that pointed toward the murderer. Of course, this was back when advanced DNA technology hadn't been developed, so there wasn't much that investigators could rely on. So they reached out to the public for help. After finding no leads, Colette's murder was the first case to be featured on the BBC TV show Crime Watch, where the producers reconstructed the events of her murder, appealing to the public to help them solve the mystery. As a result, over 400 people called the police to give them tips, and this led to the largest manhunt in the history of Nottinghamshire. The police interviewed 20,000 people, took 2,200 statements, and carried out 5,300 inquiries. But none of them led anywhere, and the killer remained at large. The case eventually went cold. Colette's episode was featured again for a second time in 2004 on the event of the show's 20th anniversary. But it was a shame that the crime just couldn't be solved. It wasn't until 2008 that the investigators were able to use DNA technology and identification procedures to pursue Colette's case once again. After picking up DNA from Colette's body, the police put together a profile of the killer and then once again asked the public to help them trace the suspect. And because the people of Britain were so involved in this particular case, they all got to work. But once again, no leads. Coincidentally, in 2008, a man named Jean-Paul Hutchinson was arrested on a monitoring charge. Now, it's standard practice to take DNA swabs from anyone who is ever arrested, and when Hutchinson's sample was run through the records, it was a perfect match to Colette's killer. But the catch was Hutchinson was only 20 years old at the time, so there's no way he could have killed Colette, right?
Jean-Paul's DNA matches the crime scene DNA profile, not entirely, but enough that makes them think, maybe this person is related to the killer.
Time was up for the killer of Colette Aram. It was Paul Hutchinson who'd skulked in the stables, a peeping Tom pervert who'd spied on young girls near Keyworth.
But His DNA helped the police trace down his father, who was 50 when he was arrested and charged with the crime. Initially, the criminal tried to pin the murder on his dead brother, but blood samples proved that the culprit was none other than him. What's strange is that when he committed the crime, his family believed that he was in the hospital getting one of his lungs removed because of cancer. To keep the charade up, Hutchinson had even shaved his head so his family wouldn't suspect him. What's weird is that Hutchinson evaded arrest and remained in the area for years to come, where he wrote anonymous letters to police about the case, just giving enough details to make sure he wasn't caught. It was a sick game that he had started to enjoy. The investigators later came to the conclusion that the man was a compulsive liar. At the time of the murder, Colette lived 7 streets away from Hutchinson in a house shared with her parents, Jacques, 63, Tony, 69, and brother Mark, now 45. The father of 4 eventually ended up pleading guilty to the crime, confessing that he had spent hours in a shed near a riding school that day, looking for girls walking home alone. He drove around a while trying to find his perfect victim in a stolen car, and that's when he spotted and abducted Colette. On January 25, 2010, nearly 27 years after Colette was brutally assaulted and murdered, her criminal was sentenced to life, bringing her family the relief they so desperately needed. As far as Hutchinson goes, 9 months after his sentence, he took a cocktail of drugs and medication in prison, dying of an overdose, bringing an end to his chapter of violence. Sarah was like any other 18-year-old in the world. She had her whole life ahead of her, and in an instant, her entire future was taken away from her. In the winter of 1989, Sarah was returning home after spending time with her boyfriend Matt Euland. The young couple had just gone on a date, and afterwards Sarah had spent some time at his house before leaving for her own. She was driving a black Ford Mustang and making her way to her destination, which is something that she often did. But on the night of December 29th, she never made it home. Sarah's body was found at 10 a.m. in the morning near train tracks in Kansas City, and the police were stunned to see the kind of violence that the poor girl had been put through. Sarah had been stabbed multiple times. Most of the wounds were on her back, and some were on her neck and chest. She was so badly injured that it was difficult for the forensic experts to determine the exact number of wounds that she had on her body. But the number they could roughly come up with was 22. And after she had succumbed to her injuries, Sarah's body was shamelessly left by the railroad tracks for someone to stumble upon. Her body was discovered by a train conductor who noticed it from his train window. He had to do a double take when he saw the body lying next to a cylindrical bridge support. But when he realized what was happening, he stopped the train and went over to confirm. A few miles away, the police found her car. And while there was no blood or signs of struggle where her car was found, the police did notice a dent on the bumper, which led them to believe that maybe the perpetrator had first tried to make the murder look like a car accident. But when that didn't work, they took Sarah to the railroad tracks and ended her life. When they came over to her body, the police noticed drag marks in the snow and gravel with small pools of all over the place, showing that the victim had been tortured before her life ended. Now, back then there were a lot of cases of bump and rob incidents around the city, where robbers would bump people's cars and rob them when they would come out to investigate the damage. For the longest time, people believed this is what happened with Sarah, only the situation escalated in her case with the robbers killing her. But considering the kind of injuries that Sarah had and the ways in which she had been injured, the police came to the conclusion that this attack was deliberate. It wasn't a random case of bumping and robbing gone wrong. The investigators were calling it a crime of passion, and this kind of crime usually involves 2 people who knew each other. There is a level of rage being expressed. This is not the bump and rob scenario, said cold case investigator Paul Holes. I'm starting to lean towards whoever killed Sarah knew her. Not only was she stabbed over 20 times, but a .44 Magnum revolver was used to end her life. The body had also been abandoned at a spot where it would have been impossible for someone to spot it. However, what the murderer didn't account for was the fact that a train conductor from the nearby tracks would be able to easily see it. Through forensic reports, it was discovered that Sarah had been killed 3 days before her body was discovered. So an investigation was launched, and everyone who knew Sarah talked about how friendly and kind she was. And while the police did suspect her boyfriend for a while, rumor had it that Yulin's ex-girlfriend could have been the one behind the crime. While Sarah was not the kind of person who was an enemy to anyone, her boyfriend's ex, Carolyn Kuhn, now Heckert, was known to resent Sarah because Matt had started dating her after breaking up with Carolyn. The investigators did have some leads on Heckert being involved in the murder, but because they never managed to find any concrete evidence against her, the case eventually went cold. Sarah's family and friends were left hanging for justice. It wasn't until 2016 that the police were forced to reopen the case when Heckert was accused of killing yet another woman, Diane Alt, a 26-year-old mother of two who was shot dead inside her own home. When the police found Carolyn at the center of yet another murder mystery, they decided to connect the dots. The police then discovered that Heckert had been linked to several cases of harassment and violence towards her romantic rivals, which included both Diana and Sarah. In 1994, Heckert broke into Diana's home and killed her right in front of her children in a fit of jealousy and rage. It was later discovered that Heckert had previously been involved with Diana's husband, Tim, while he was married to her. And when he decided to call the affair off, she became obsessed. She started stalking Diana and Tim, making threatening phone calls to their house, and even breaking in once, only to use red lipstick and write the words, "Thanks for the use of the bed," on Diana's bathroom mirror.
Almost 30 years have gone by, but many people still remember Diana Alt, like Steve Coronado, who worked with her in the early 90s at the start of both their careers.
She was a paralegal at the firm. I was a 3 or 4 year associate at the time. I just remember her as always being pleasant. She was a hard worker.
I told her, I said, tell you what, I said, you go back to school, I'll pay your salary. And I said, at that point, you can get your degree. And I said, you don't have to worry about going to work. Well, that never did materialize.
Diana's son, Josh, who was 4 years old at the time, remembers the event as much as he can. "I can still remember being put in the closet," says Josh. "I can remember the police showing up, and that's about it. I think the hardest part is looking back at pictures and stuff that brings back the memories."
It's not ever something that anyone hears and goes, "Oh yeah, expected that," you know. I think it's unfortunate, and for so long to be hidden, that's a tough thing.
Other neighbors told us Heckert was not the most approachable. They mentioned a no trespassing sign that just went up on her property today. They also said Heckert was building a new home.
What's so strange is that Caroline Heckert appeared to be the perfect mother. She worked as a real estate agent and lived a double life for almost 30 years, with no one suspecting her to be dangerous at all. Heckert was a respected property dealer, so it was a shocking day when U.S. Marshals broke into their home on October 19, 2016, and arrested her not only for the murder of Diana, but also Sarah De Leon.
Walking away from the Wyandotte County Jail arm in arm with her husband following that preliminary hearing.
After discovering Diana's dead body and linking her death to Carolyn, the police found DNA evidence which helped them solve the mystery of Sarah's brutal death. Sadly, though, no concrete evidence has tied Heckert to De Leon's murder, so all of this is still up in the air with no charges being filed against her. What's even sadder is that Heckert has been released from custody and hasn't been charged with the murder of Diane Alt either because of an overwhelming lack of evidence. The prosecution claimed that the motive was there, but they just couldn't prove it. This cold case is one that shook the entire world because of how brutal it was. Carla Walker was the perfect high school cheerleader. She did well in her classes, had a great social life, and a boyfriend, Rodney McCoy, who absolutely loved her. According to their friends, the couple had a great relationship. They never fought, and everyone knew that they were just meant to be. In fact, Rodney had even gotten her a promise ring. In February 1964, Carla and her boyfriend were out on a date. Carla was 17 at the time, and the couple had gone out to a Valentine's Day dance with each other. After that, they had partied with their friends and stopped by a local bowling alley to get some drinks and use the bathroom. But what they didn't know was that this little pit stop would change their lives forever. From what I remember, we were talking and we started kissing, and she was leaning up against the door and the door just jerked open. McCoy told the DNA of murder.
When he opened the door, we both our heads both fell out of the car, basically.
The couple was waiting in Carla's car in the parking lot while their friends went about their business. They were busy talking when all of a sudden someone walked up to the car, pulled McCoy out of the vehicle, and started beating him up. The attacker was a white male, approximately 5 foot 10 inches tall. The high school quarterback was beaten to the point where he passed out, and when he woke up, he found that his girlfriend was nowhere to be found. This kicked off an area-wide search for Carla that ended only when her battered, dead body was discovered 4 days later in a culvert beneath a rural road south of Fort Worth. And the condition that she was found in was horrible, to say the least. Carla's clothes were ripped and she had been beaten, tortured, and assaulted before the culprit strangled her to death. The police also found morphine in her system, which might have been used to subdue her while all of this went on. Of course, the investigators knew immediately that this was a targeted attack that was motivated by some form of jealousy. However, what was strange was that the investigators did not find any evidence at the crime scene. When Rodney was able to process the whole situation, he spoke to the police once again and described the attack in greater detail. He said that the culprit was a tall man with short brown hair. He had been wearing a vest and had a pistol on him, which he used to hit Rodney over the head. Rodney remembers the man grabbing Carla saying, "You're coming with me, aren't you, sweetie?" Then he remembers his girlfriend screaming at him to get her dad before he blacked out.
Carla turned her face to me, and I can visualize, and said, "Rodney, go get Dad. Go get my dad."
Rodney woke up at around 1 a.m. and he immediately drove over to the Walkers' home, interrupting a dinner with blood dripping down his face. It only took Carla's dad a second to realize that something terrible had happened. "They've got her, Mr. Walker," said Rodney. "They're going to hurt her bad." That night, the police spent hours looking for Carla. They found her purse at a crime scene, along with a clip that had been ejected from the criminal's gun, but nothing else until 4 days later, when Carla's body was discovered. The police also received a strange letter addressed to the detective investigating the case. "Killed Carla Walker in Benbrell," said the letter. But to this day, the police don't know if it was actually sent by the killer or if it was just someone playing a cruel joke. The letter ends with a P.S. It's hard to say, but it's true. The crime took everyone in Fort Worth by surprise. Because the town is so small, no one really thought of locking their doors or watching out for criminals because, well, things like this just don't happen there. So it's safe to say that the whole town showed up to pay respects to Carla at her funeral. The neighborhood completely changed after that. No one trusted anyone, and all the women signed up for some kind of self-defense classes. The police, of course, continued their search, but the case went cold with absolutely no leads. They had no fingerprints to trace, the blood on Carla's dress was all Rodney's, and the bodily fluids they found on her just couldn't be traced because advanced DNA technology didn't exist back then. The police set up a hotline for people to speak up if they had any evidence, and tons of callers told them that Carla had been attacked by a pair of marijuana dealers. Some said that the criminal was a carnival worker, and some said that it was a boy Rodney had gotten into an argument with the night before the dance. But the strangest call the police got was from a man who wasn't revealing his name. He claimed he knew the murderer, and he also knew that he never meant to kill Carla. He only wanted to assault her. Strange, isn't it? But the truth is that the man who was behind the murder had already been on the police's radar. They just hadn't connected the dots. A 31-year-old truck driver named Glenn McCurley had been previously linked to Becky Martin's murder. The gruesome details between Becky and Carla's murder were too pointed to be ignored. Becky was strangled to death, and her body had also been discovered at the same place where the police found Carla, and the whole thing was just too coincidental. Now, while there was essentially no evidence linking McCurley to both crimes, the police had their doubts. McCurley had a troubled childhood. The man had also previously been involved in petty crimes like auto theft and had actually been arrested as well. But it seemed like he had moved past his old ways of life and married a nice girl named Judy Watson. The two moved to a small rental home in Fort Worth and had 2 sons, Craig and Roddy. Judy worked at the local church and Glenn was a truck driver. To everyone on the outside, they were a perfect, happy family. But the neighbors had their reservations against Glenn. Anytime he would see a pretty girl, he'd make it a point to pass creepy remarks about her. So with this lead, detectives took Glenn in for questioning, but because of a lack of evidence, they had to dismiss him as a suspect. Carla's murder went cold for 46 years. During this time, several other women were found murdered and abandoned in the same way Carla had. The victims included 25-year-old June Ward, a vocational nurse who had been murdered and stripped naked. Then there was 19-year-old Denise Hugh, who was found at a creek bridge in Fort Worth. She too had been strangled. 2 years later, the police found Christy Tower, a waitress murdered in the same way, her hands bound with electrical wire, and another wire twisted around her neck. But once again, there was no evidence that the police could trace. The tragedies kept piling up. Sydney Heller, Katherine Jackson, Angela Ewert, Regina Grover, and several other women fell prey to whoever this brutal killer was. Eventually, everyone sort of gave up. And it wasn't until 2022 when the killer was finally caught, and it was none other than the initial suspect, Glenn McCurley. But how did the police trace him after all these years? The truth is that conducting DNA tests on Carla's clothes was costing $20,000. So despite her family's insistence, the police wanted to spend that money on active cases. That's when Paul Holes, a retired homicide investigator, stepped up and offered to have the producers of his true crime show cover the cost. So the testing started once again. But the only sample that the technicians could find was on the strap of her bra, which they used to develop a DNA profile. The genome testing, though, led the police to a family with the surname McCurley, and suddenly, everything made sense. The investigation was opened once again, and the police found their way to Glenn McCurley. He seemed to be a good man leading a quiet life. One woman had even sent a letter to the Fort Worth Star-Telegram praising him and Judy for returning her lost wallet. "The world needs more folks like this," she wrote. But detectives had developed an entirely different perspective on McCurley. They had compelling evidence that he was responsible for the notorious unsolved murder of a teenage girl in 1974. And they suspected that wasn't his only crime. They considered him a person of interest in at least 3 other killings of young women during the 70s and 80s.
I've never seen her before. I don't know who she is. If she's standing right beside of me, you say it's what's her name?
Carla Walker. So you've never met her before, never seen her?
I've never seen her, never met her, never talked to her, I wouldn't know her if she was standing beside of me.
When McCurley denied these allegations, the police asked him to give a DNA sample, since that would be the easiest way to eliminate him as a suspect. And as predicted, the DNA sample from his cheek perfectly matched the one found on Carla, bringing this case and many others to a close after several years of agony. McCurley was then taken to trial, and on the 3rd day, he ended up pleading guilty.
I just choked her.
But when questioned why he did so, he maintained the claim that he had not killed any of these women and had only pleaded so everyone would stop hounding him. So, how did he explain his DNA on her? According to Glenn, he was driving around on the night of Carla's murder when he heard the girl screaming. He said he went up to check on her and saw her boyfriend forcing himself on her. McCurley said that he got into a fight with her boyfriend, trying to save her, after which Carla thanked him and hugged him, and that's what led to the two having sex. I don't remember too much from there on, claims the suspect. He went on to say that he did choke Carla because he was scared she would tell everyone what had happened. But when asked if he had killed her, or several other women, his answer was a huge no. But because the evidence against him was overwhelming, Glenn was charged and convicted for Carla's gruesome murder. However, since there is no evidence linking him to all the other murders around Fort Worth, all the other women sadly still await justice, even though everyone agrees that their culprit probably is none other than McCurley, considering how sick the criminal really is.